Since childhood, we absorb the world around us like a sponge. Every word, every look, every gesture has the power to leave marks on our minds, some so deep that they continue to accompany us even when we believe we have left the past behind. Childhood is the period when we are most vulnerable, and that is precisely why the experiences we live through at this stage have such a significant impact on our adult lives. Carl Jung, one of the greatest names in psychology, saw these emotional marks as something inevitable. He believed that childhood wounds are not just painful memories, but forces that silently operate within us, influencing the way we think, feel, and relate to others. Without even realizing it, we carry these experiences like an invisible burden, shaping our decisions, our fears, and even the way we see ourselves. Now imagine that inside you, there is a kind of backpack where all these experiences have been stored over the years. Words that were spoken to you, moments that marked you, emotions you experienced. Everything is there, weighing on you in a way you may have never stopped to reflect on. But what happens when we decide to open this backpack and look inside? What do we find when we revisit the pains that seemed buried? Jung believed that facing these wounds was not just a process of liberation, but a fundamental necessity for anyone who seeks true inner peace. That is because these experiences do not simply disappear with time. They become part of who we are, influencing our choices and the way we connect with others. Often we believe that we have already overcome the past, that we have grown, and that none of it matters anymore. But if we look closely, we will realize that certain situations in our present life trigger familiar feelings, sensations that did not arise out of nowhere but stem from much earlier, from childhood moments that were never truly understood or healed. The real question is, to what extent do these wounds still control your life? Could the way you react to certain situations today have roots in something that happened long ago? Could the fears and insecurities you feel be more connected to the past than to the present? Jung said that what we do not bring to consciousness ends up controlling our lives without us realizing it. In other words, as long as we do not look at these wounds attentively, they will continue to guide us unconsciously, determining our behaviors, our relationships, and even our limits. The key to healing does not lie in ignoring what happened, but in understanding the impact of those experiences. The first step in this transformation is recognizing that childhood wounds are not just distant memories, but active forces that shape our existence. And if we want to free ourselves from the weight we carry, we must have the courage to face them head-on, to give meaning to these experiences, and finally, to transform them into learning. This process may not be easy, but it is essential. And as we dive into this journey, we begin to realize that pain does not have to define who we are. It can, in fact, be the starting point for a new story. A story in which we are no longer prisoners of the past, but protagonists of a lighter and more conscious future. In childhood, we are like a blank canvas, ready to absorb everything around us. We do not just learn words and concepts, but also emotions, beliefs, and ways of interpreting the world. At this stage, we do not have the ability to question or rationalize the events around us. We simply feel. A simple look of disapproval, a thoughtless comment, or even the absence of affection can leave deep marks that will accompany us for a lifetime. Carl Jung believed that these marks were not just memories, but emotional imprints that shape the structure of our psyche. What we experience in childhood turns into internal patterns that repeat in adulthood, influencing our decisions, our relationships, and even our self-esteem. For Jung, these experiences were not just individual. They were also connected to something greater, something he called the collective unconscious. This means that, beyond carrying our own wounds, we also inherit pains and beliefs that come from previous generations. The fear of not being good enough, the feeling of abandonment, or the difficulty in trusting may not have started with you, but with your parents, grandparents, or even distant ancestors. The problem is that these marks rarely appear in obvious ways. Often they disguise themselves in automatic behaviors and reactions. Have you ever wondered why you feel an irrational fear of rejection, or why you struggle to express your emotions without guilt or shame? The answers may be hidden back in your childhood when your mind was still being shaped by the experiences you lived through. This is where one of Jung's most important psychological concepts comes in: the shadow. The shadow represents all the parts of us that were repressed or rejected because, in some way, we learned that they were not acceptable. If, in childhood, you felt that you could not show sadness without being reprimanded, you may have learned to hide your pain. If you were constantly criticized whenever you tried to express yourself, you may have developed an unconscious fear of being judged. What we do not realize is that everything we try to hide or deny remains there, operating behind the scenes of our lives. And the more we deny these wounds, the more they control our destiny. They appear in the choices we make, the relationships we cultivate, and even in the dreams we abandon before we even try to achieve them. Jung said that, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This means that, as long as we do not bring these hidden pains to the surface, we will continue to repeat the same patterns, often without understanding why. So, if we truly want to transform our story, we need to take a step back and honestly look at what we have lived through. What marked you? What words or situations are engraved in your memory? What emotions do you still feel when you think about your childhood? Only when we start asking ourselves these questions do we realize that our past does not have to define who we are. It can, in fact, help us understand how we got here and, more than that, give us the keys to changing the course of our own lives. Now, by looking within, you may begin to realize that these wounds are not a punishment or a burden you must carry forever. They are, in fact, an invitation to healing, an opportunity to understand yourself on a deeper level. If we want to understand how past wounds continue to influence us in the present, we need to observe how they manifest. Not all childhood wounds are the same, but they all leave traces that, if ignored, can turn into behavioral patterns that trap us. Jung believed that these experiences were not just isolated events, but forces that shape our psyche and unconsciously guide us. That is why, even when we try to move forward, we often find ourselves repeating the same emotional cycles, falling into the same traps, and reacting in the same way to certain situations. These wounds can take different forms, but some are especially striking. The feeling of rejection, for example, can begin early when a child realizes they are not accepted as they are. If, from a young age, they feel the need to strive to be loved, to change or hide parts of themselves to be valued, this belief can become a burden they carry throughout life. In adulthood, this can manifest as a fear of exposure, difficulty establishing deep relationships, or a constant need for validation. Abandonment is another common wound, and it does not have to happen literally. Sometimes a parent may be physically present but emotionally distant. A child who grows up without feeling emotionally nurtured may develop a constant sense of insecurity, a deep fear of being alone. And this feeling does not disappear with time, it simply transforms. In the future, it may manifest as emotional dependency, difficulty trusting others, or even the opposite, a fear of becoming too attached to avoid the risk of being left behind. Humiliation can also leave marks that are difficult to erase. When a child is constantly criticized, ridiculed, or treated as if they are not enough, they learn to doubt their own worth. Growing up under this weight can result in fragile self-esteem, leading to a constant need to prove their value, or in some cases, a tendency towards self-sabotage. Often those who were humiliated in childhood end up avoiding any situation where they might be judged, preferring to hide rather than risk failing again. Betrayal, on the other hand, occurs when someone a child trusts significantly breaks that trust. It could be an unfulfilled promise from an adult, a lack of support in a crucial moment, or even more serious situations. The result? Difficulty trusting people, fear of vulnerability, and often an excessive need for control. People who carry this wound may feel that they must always be in control of situations, avoiding depending on others to prevent disappointment again. These wounds are not just scars from the past. They remain alive within us, guiding our choices and interfering with the way we live. And what is most striking is that we often do not even realize we are reacting to something that happened years ago. That is why Jung stated that self-knowledge is the path to liberation. Only when we recognize the origin of these pains can we begin to change the patterns that imprison us. But these wounds are not static. They evolve, transform, and, if left unhealed, continue to manifest subtly. Some appear in our relationships, others prevent us from expressing ourselves freely, and others make us believe we are not enough. So how can we identify the signs that these wounds are still influencing us? How can we perceive the real impact of these wounds on our adult lives? Childhood wounds do not stay behind just because we grow up. They remain alive within us, shaping the way we think, feel, and act. Often, without realizing it, we react to the present based on the pains of the past. This means that if we do not recognize these emotional marks, we may spend our lives repeating the same patterns of suffering without understanding why. Jung believed that what is not brought to consciousness governs our lives as if it were fate. In other words, until we see the roots of these wounds, they will continue to influence us without us noticing. One of the most common reflections of these wounds appears in relationships. People who experienced rejection in childhood may develop an unconscious fear of being abandoned and, as a result, may act in extreme ways. Either they avoid deep connections to protect themselves from being hurt, or they cling too tightly, fearing the loss of connection. Similarly, those who grew up with the wound of abandonment may end up attracting unstable relationships, repeating the cycle of emotional instability because, in some way, this dynamic already feels familiar. Another significant impact is on self-esteem. If, in childhood, we learned that we were not good enough, whether through constant criticism, humiliation, or comparisons, that belief stays with us. We become insecure adults, afraid of making mistakes, always seeking validation from others. That inner voice that says, "You will never be good enough," or "Don't try because you will fail," is an echo from the past, an emotional memory that has not yet been healed. Self-sabotage is also a silent but powerful symptom. How many times have you had an incredible opportunity but hesitated to take it? Maybe you procrastinated, doubted yourself, or even gave up before trying. This happens because, often, our mind associates success with the risk of being exposed, criticized, or rejected, and to avoid that pain, we end up sabotaging ourselves. It may seem irrational, but for our psyche, it is a defense mechanism. If I do not try, I do not risk failing and reliving the pain of the past. Moreover, childhood wounds can create emotional barriers. Those who were betrayed or disappointed in childhood may carry a great difficulty in trusting others. It may seem like a simple issue, but in practice, it affects all areas of life, from romantic relationships to the way we interact with colleagues or friendships. The need for control, excessive distrust, and even difficulty opening up emotionally can be direct reflections of a pain that was never resolved. And what is most striking is that these wounds do not only affect the way we relate to others, but also how we see ourselves. They can make us feel insufficient, disconnected from our emotions, or even without a clear purpose in life. Many people carry a constant sense of emptiness, trying to fill it with work, distractions, or superficial relationships, without realizing that this feeling has much deeper roots. But there is good news. These patterns are not permanent. Just as they were formed, they can be transformed. The question is, how do we take the first step toward this change? How do we break out of this cycle and begin to reframe these wounds? Before we talk about healing itself, we need to understand the importance of the individuation process, the fundamental concept in Jung's theory for true transformation. Healing childhood wounds does not mean erasing the past or pretending that nothing happened. The true healing process, according to Carl Jung, begins when we recognize these pains and understand that they are part of us, but they no longer need to define us. Jung called this journey individuation, the path to becoming who we truly are, free from the masks we created to protect ourselves. This process is not about achieving perfection, but about integrating all parts of our psyche, including those we have tried to hide or deny. But before we talk about how we can transform these wounds, we need to understand something fundamental. We cannot heal what we deny. Many of us grow up hearing that we should not look back, that we just need to move forward. However, ignoring our pain does not make it disappear. On the contrary, it allows it to continue operating in our unconscious, influencing our choices without us realizing it. That is why the first step toward healing is awareness. Becoming aware of emotional wounds means looking within and recognizing how these patterns are present in our lives. It is not enough to intellectually understand that we had difficult childhood experiences. We must feel and process these emotions. This can be uncomfortable at first because it requires us to confront parts of ourselves that we may have spent years trying to avoid. But Jung believed that true transformation happens when we illuminate the darker parts of our psyche. He said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And this darkness is nothing more than what Jung called the shadow, the aspects of ourselves that we repress because in some way we learned that they were not acceptable. Our shadow holds emotions such as anger, fear, sadness, and vulnerability, feelings that were often ignored or repressed in childhood. But ignoring them does not make them disappear. Instead, they continue to influence our actions in subtle ways. The problem is that many people fear looking at their own shadow because they associate it with something negative. But the truth is that when we begin to integrate this part of ourselves, we realize that it also holds our strength, our authenticity, and our capacity for transformation. Because healing is not just about overcoming pain, it is about learning from it. It is about transforming wounds into wisdom, fears into courage, and insecurities into self-knowledge. This process does not happen overnight. Emotional healing is not linear. It is a path that requires patience and a willingness to dive deep into oneself. But as we open ourselves to this journey, we start to see that we are not broken. We simply carry stories that need to be understood and redefined. Now that we understand the importance of individuation and shadow integration, the question is, how, in practice, can we begin this process? What are the tools and strategies that can help us transform these wounds into growth and emotional freedom? The journey to healing childhood wounds is not an easy path, but it is possible. And more than that, it is necessary. Jung believed that true emotional freedom only comes when we look within, recognizing our pain and integrating everything we once tried to hide. But this is not just a journey of introspection. It also requires action. We need to find ways to transform these wounds into learning and growth, and there are several strategies that can help us in this process. One of the most powerful strategies is connecting with our inner child. Within each of us still lives the child we once were, with their fears, dreams, and pain. Often this child was ignored, repressed, or even silenced because we learned that certain emotions were not welcome. But healing only begins when we learn to look at this part of ourselves with compassion. This can be done in different ways. A simple yet transformative exercise is to take a moment to visualize the child within you. Close your eyes and imagine yourself as a young child. How old are you in this image? How do you feel? What does this child need to hear? Instead of trying to erase or deny these memories, try to embrace them. Speak to this child as you would to someone you love, with care and understanding. Tell them that you are here now, that they no longer need to carry this pain alone. Another fundamental step is self-acceptance. Many childhood wounds turn into feelings of guilt and shame, making us believe that we are not good enough. But these beliefs are not absolute truths. They are simply stories that were told to us and that we learn to repeat. To change this, we must start reframing these narratives. An effective practice to strengthen self-acceptance is therapeutic writing. Write a letter to yourself, acknowledging your pain but also your strength. Instead of focusing on what was missing or what went wrong, try to see what you have learned from these experiences. Self-acceptance does not mean ignoring difficulties, but rather recognizing that they are part of your story and that you have the power to rewrite it. But this journey does not have to be solitary. One of the most important steps in emotional healing is building healthy relationships. Often, childhood wounds lead us to repeat patterns of toxic relationships because, in some way, we are trying to fix what was left unresolved. The problem is that we seek these answers in the wrong places. That is why learning to establish healthy boundaries is essential. If you grew up believing that you needed to please others to be loved, saying no without feeling guilty may be difficult. But setting boundaries is not selfish, it is self-care. And as we begin to surround ourselves with people who respect and value us, we realize that we no longer need to relive old patterns. Emotional healing does not happen instantly, and each person has their own pace. But every small step is an act of courage, a sign that you are choosing to free yourself from the chains of the past. As Jung said, "Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens." And by looking within, you are beginning the most transformative process of your life, the process of becoming truly yourself. Your past does not define your future. Your wounds do not determine who you are. And from this moment forward, you have the power to start a new story.